All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World Affairs Conference on World Affairs on the UMC campus, the Boulder, Colorado campus. Thank you for coming. This is a nice big event with lots of great speakers. So today is Tuesday, April 10th, and the panel is number 2302, entitled China and the U.S. Race to the Economic Top. I have some fantastic speakers I will be introducing, and then we will enjoy some questions from the audience. Let's see. We have let me read the statement about questions. There's two ways to do it. One of them is going to be on the app, and I will receive the questions, and I will decide which questions work well. And we also have cards that the producers are handing out. If there's a producer, would you raise your hand there? There's a couple, two or three of them. There's three producers in the back. If you need a pencil and paper to put the card on there. So we're using both the app and a note card system. Let's see. If you're a student, put down that you're a student. And please write legibly and make your questions brief and to the point. So we have a fantastic panel today. Very briefly, my name is Tom Gailey. I went to University of Colorado, and I was just telling Jeffrey, who's a professor here, that I graduated from the economics department that he is in charge of right now. Yay, economics! Yay, economics. I actually went to Uni Hill Elementary School, which is across the street, if anybody knows that one. I am currently a teacher at Front Range Community College, where I teach economics and international business. Part of my career involved living in Taiwan for 6 or 7 years. I lived in Guam for 8 years, so I worked out of China doing consulting, plastic injected molding and things like that. So I have a little bit of background there. So I would like to introduce the panelists right here. We're going to have each one of them speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will take some of the questions. So my first fantastic speaker, Peter, to my immediate left here. Peter and I are pretty tight. We did the same panel, a similar panel last year. And so between Peter and Larry next to him, we've done some of these China panels before. These guys are absolute experts in the field. Peter has spent, I don't know, over 30 years working and living in China and Asia. A mosaicist. I meant to ask you about that. That's making mosaics? Okay, good. Maybe we won't get to that. And a calligrapher. Peter has a couple of books, and I always want to push books. There's a bookstore over at the Mackey Auditorium, and it's great. You should go over there and patronize our fine speakers because the books are great. Peter's got a couple of books over there. One of them is, well, it's in the bio. He's got a new book that is with the editors, which speaks to the adoption of his children, two children? His two girls that he adopted from China. And the book proceeds go to One Sky, his charity, which all the proceeds go to One Sky, and that charity takes care of children that are not adopted in Asia and China. So there's Peter. Larry Greenwood, next speaker over from Larry has worked, again, over 30 years as a career diplomat in Asia. Larry worked in with the Asian Development Bank. He spent years in Manila co-leading the Asian Development Bank. And he's been with the Bauer Group, a consultancy firm based in D.C. And something interesting is that Peter and Larry were on television 2 years ago and were just given the right to be on television again last night on the Ralph Gregory Show, Channel 8, which was taped last night, which you'll be able to see, I think, next week. Not sure when that comes up, but you'll be able to see. Yeah, look for that thing. These guys were on a show just last night. My next speaker down the row there is Jose de la Fuente, and Jose's background is diverse and global. He has been all over the world. He's more from Chile, but part educated in the United States. He's developed import-export systems for Chile's Federal Reserve. These guys are big, heavy hitters. He worked with the management of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in that region. Let's see. Jose has done a lot of market entry strategies for big name companies, and I thought it would be interesting to point out that he's worked with a number of big names that we recognize, such as K2 and Volkel and Coleman and Marmot, among others. These are big brand names, big sporting good brand names. He's also run divisions in Beijing to do market entry projects. So he's basically entered markets all over the world. And my last introduction is Jeffrey Zaks. He's a professor and associate chair over at the economics department, and PhD from Harvard, a BA from Harvard also. He has published papers, very interesting papers, about residential segregation, papers on unions and wages. So these are public peer-reviewed papers that he's worked with. A couple of courses that Jeffrey teaches here would be the economics of inequality and discrimination. That's one course that he's teaching. And there's another course I wanted to point out, which is it's applied economics, where students analyze public policy. They write bills, students right here, they write bills, they take it down to the legislature, they introduce those bills, and they argue those bills with economic basis of fact to work with. So that's some of the stuff that Jeffrey's been doing. So we're going to hear from these fine speakers, and then we'll take some questions. So, Jeffrey, take it away.
Oh, goodness, thank you.
I'm sorry. Peter.
All right, to hell with you.
Start here and go that way.
To make way for Jeffrey, I'll quote Henry VIII, what he said to his wives, "I shan't keep you long." I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome to the students who are here. I'm most pleased to see them. For me, this is a far more profound story than mere economics. And in fact, a foil for this discussion is both Brexit and something that I call Amer-exit. I think when it comes to China and America now, we're talking about role reversal. I think China has always taken the long view. You might recall when someone asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the French Revolution, he said it was too soon to tell. But China has always been very tactical. I think America struggles to maintain a peripheral vision, but has been strategic. But is America now standing aside and inadvertently doing China's bidding? China's winning combination of the long view with newfound strategic vision. Just look at the Belt and Road visionary view of Central Asia and its approach to the South China Sea. It's extraordinary to see what is in China's sights. My fear now is that America has gradually caved into myopia and bean counting, making way for China. We have withdrawn from TPP. We're initially hostile to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and have endorsed an America Great mantra, which is making America little. My great fear is the loss of the American patina as an aspirational nation. When immigrants want to stop coming here, all is lost. Countries in big trouble are those with declining populations. Larry and I have spoken about this at length. Just witness Italy or Japan. And thus far, hopefully, no one yet wants a Chinese or a Russian passport. May it long stay that way. Come on, let's hear it. Now, a few comments on economics. I'd just like to mention, I was the chairman of J.P. Morgan in China at the time of the Great Recession, which was no walk in the park. I was the legal signatory for the bank, and it was a terrifying time with me. I lost all my hair. But in America, after the Great Recession of 2008, our economy was recovering well. Unemployment was down. The stock market was up. Corporations were awash in cash. buying back shares, and not supporting wage improvement. Trickle-down was already not working. The new administration has tapped into disenfranchised Americans who had lost their voice, like me, prompting them to vote against their own interests. I'll give you just an example. This is a Brexit example. In Sunderland, in northern England, there was huge unemployment after Mrs. Thatcher did in the coal industry. Nissan came in and built its largest plant in the world to sell cars only into Europe because England was part of the EU. Everyone in Sunderland voted for Brexit. Have a nice day. I always held Republicans in regard because of their mantra of fiscal responsibility. But they have now relinquished that jewel in their crown by passing a tax bill which puts us in a $1.5 trillion hole that does not come to the aid of their disenfranchised supporters. What good are our tariffs? Steel and aluminum cannot do battle with theft of intellectual property, but Chinese tariffs on soybeans strategically stick it to the farmers. Let's look at China. Let's start with the power grab at the top by Xi Jinping. He masked his ascendance as an anti-corruption campaign, which of course appealed to the local level. It was sort of like bread and circuses because people like seeing the crooks get it in the neck. But at the top, there was unprecedented consolidation of power in Xi, and he now has he's in office for life, even surpassing the reach of Deng Xiaoping. We now are looking at a visionary dictator presiding over a robust economy that must deliver to survive. By the way, no country has a greater stake in America's success than China, bankrolling us by purchasing our T-bills. I'm always puzzled by our discomfort by being the beneficiary of such daunting investment. Suspicion rather than gratitude. The Russians give us nothing, and we are enamored of them. Go figure. By withdrawing from the world diplomatically and economically, we are making way for China at the very time that we object to China's ascendance. We need to stand beside China and not suggest that the only way for America to be great is to do the contrary. Thank you.
I should say that, as you could hear, Peter has laryngitis. He actually just had surgery about 4 to 6 weeks ago, and that's the reason he speaks like this. It's kind of sexy, I think, but anyway.
Don't go there.
Okay.
I'm less convinced.
Race to the economic top is, so when I saw that topic, I guess the first question that came to my mind is, so how do you define the economic top? Because in economics, size doesn't always matter. Not to continue on that theme, but I am. I'm looking at two elements in looking at the race to the economic top. One is that reaching the top means that a country has an economic policy that ensures and facilitates sustainable, equitable growth in per capita income for its citizens. So that's a domestic economic, domestic economic success obviously is necessary if you're going for the race to the top. And in that case, size doesn't matter because if you're looking around the world, then countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, Singapore would be considered and are very economically successful. But the second factor I would look at, and the more relevant, well, they're both relevant for this discussion, is the ability to influence things outside your borders with your economic strength and might and influence. And so it's to create an international environment for trade and investment which is good for your country, to have influence over decisions on economic policy and on in terms of market access for your companies outside your country. And to promote prosperity and growth around the world, because after all, the world is going to be, even for China, the world is a bigger market than your national market. And so, and that's particularly the case, obviously, for the United States, which only constitutes 4% of the world. So our major markets, for the United States, our major potential growth is, not potential growth, our growth in the future is going to come from growth of foreign markets, not from the growth of our domestic market. So those two factors, and in that case, that size does matter, and the ability to influence the environment. So size matters a lot. So let's look at those two factors. In particular, I'll start with China and how they're doing in terms of delivering on those two areas. So on the domestic front, China has, let me start with the macro side. So China, about more than 10 years ago, before the global financial crisis, actually in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, began to have questions and concerns about whether its economic growth model was still working, and realized that it was slowing down and it was not working anymore. That traditional growth model, I say traditional, dates from 1979 and the reforms that Deng Xiaoping put in, is export-oriented, moving people from the villages and the rural areas to the cities so they can work in factories to export products from those factories, mostly owned by foreigners, and infrastructure investment that's supplied by largely state-owned enterprises. So that combination of exports and infrastructure investment and moving people from the villages to the cities resulted in an explosion of economic growth in China that hasn't been seen in the history of mankind, bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, again, never seen in the history of mankind. So a wonderful success, but that was slowing down and breaking down. In 2008, the Chinese saw very clearly that that growth model was broken entirely, because they could no longer rely on, first of all, foreign markets. The foreign markets dried up. They had the growth rate tumbled. It was very much a crisis for the country, and they got through it through various fiscal, mainly fiscal, but some monetary policies as well. But they've been starting already for 10 years, coming up with a new growth model that basically means moving away from infrastructure and exports more to domestic consumption and a service-oriented and innovation-oriented economy. So and they're very much, that's their plan. The question is, how easy is it for them to actually execute that plan? The execution of the plan has been spotty, and it's been a struggle for them. And so, particularly, mainly because there's very strong vested interest in the SOEs, but for other reasons as well. Just mainly vested interest. Once you have vested interest in the economy, it's just hard to displace them. So they struggled with that. So that's the macro side. For the micro side, they put in place a very aggressive industrial policy to create national champions, to try to push innovation through a very kind of government-directed manner. That doesn't mean they don't have very strong private sector companies, by the way. They have some very good private sector companies. Alibaba and Huawei, I would say, I would consider private sector. But they still have a very strong and very indebted and very weak SOE sector, economically weak, politically strong. So they've got their challenges on that side as well. And to add on to that, the industrial policy, of course, is putting them in direct conflict with their trading partners, in particular the United States, because this is where we now have our conflict with U.S. in the sense that a lot of that industrial policy, because it's about creating national champions, is keeping foreign companies out of China so they can develop these national champions and then export those national champions globally. Actually, not unlike what Japan was trying to do in the 80s, the 70s, well, mainly 80s and 90s, or 80s. And so the question there is, will that succeed or not? And so there are issues on that as well. I mean, Japan tried this and did not succeed. Now you can say that China it will have more success because it's bigger, and it can afford to have Chinese standards that kind of ignore international standards. But I don't know. And you can also say that government-driven innovation may or may not work. I live in Silicon Valley, and we don't think government-led innovation will work, but maybe it will. I mean, and there are some signs that China is succeeding in certain areas. Is it sustainable? Can a party-driven government, a Communist Party-driven policy that's focused on, in particular, on preserving the party, can it really? Is it compatible with innovation and a modern service economy? maybe China will come up with the answer. I don't know, but that's the challenge that China faces. So, just very briefly on the second element of influence, and I'll just go quickly because my time is up. The One Belt, One Road is the main focus for that, and including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And that is, as Peter said, is a very well thought out policy of making connections between China through Central Asia, into essentially East Europe and then through Southeast Asia into South Asia. Very ambitious, but also fraught with difficulties in terms of execution for that as well. It's not going to be easy to do that. They're not giving this money away. They're lending it. Their interest rates are relatively high compared to other lenders. So it's not going to be an easy ride there either. On the other hand, they have an open ride in the sense that there isn't any kind of competition to that because, as Peter has pointed out, the U.S. is at least initially is kind of is in a confused state with regard to Asian policy, maybe is the most charitable way to put it, and is still trying to figure out how to offer an alternative to that. President Trump, when he was in Vietnam, did say that that U.S. is going to do that we're going to offer an alternative to the Chinese infrastructure financing packages that will be, that won't violate the sovereignty of the countries that we're lending to, that will employ their people as opposed to bringing in Chinese workers, that will be more commercially successful and more productive. But we have yet to see what that, the details of that. So that's so I don't have the answer who's going to win the race. Those are the elements of the race, and we'll see how it comes out.
Well, I think on a little different note on this race, I think that today the race has sort of hit a hyperspace velocity. We look at the Star Trek fans. I think that when one of the discussions late last year and what to talk about on my visit here, and this subject came up, I said, yeah, sounds very interesting. Now all of a sudden it's like the #1 topic, so it's very exciting. Well, I think that the key thing to know about China, probably some of you knew, but I mean, we're talking here a difference of GDP size, so that's another way of measuring who's in the top. U.S. with $19 trillion versus China with 11.9, so there's a big delta still there. If you look at the next country over is Japan with 4.9, based on IMF projections for 2017. So today, I think there's an interesting analysis that actually our Chilean economist made the other day, was that for every 5 points in tariff that's increased between the U.S. and China, we'll have a loss in growth of between 0.1 to 0.3 at a global level. So, I mean, whatever happens here affects the whole world, and 0.1% to 0.3% on our growth on a global level. So that's how important it is how everybody's watching this. The other thing that's, start discussion on steel and aluminum. I mean, I'm looking at this from, being from Chile, from South America, and see how you guys battle it out. But I think really starting with steel and aluminum, I mean, China is the 11th exporter to the U.S. of steel and aluminum, so it's sort of, let's just start talking about something. Okay, just like, North Korea subject, I feel that this discussion today is bringing us to a point where, just like North Korea was brought to the top, there was a lot of fuss made about it. Now all of a sudden we don't hear about him. He's said he's going to meet him sometime in May, to the leader of North Korea, but it's not become a non-subject. Now China is a subject. So I think there's a lot of competition beyond an economic competition. There's a competition on words. I think that in numbers, GDP growth for China is a tremendous success story. I mean, just like I said, CAGR of 10% between 1978 and 2016. So in any economic or business world, that's tremendous sustained growth. And I think that one of the things we need to look at China, like I'm looking on the business side, is just having one CEO and one strategic plan for so many years really pays out, versus all of our countries that, we have democracy, so obviously one day it's one party, the next is the other party, and whatever the other guy did is no good. So that means that we change our strategies, and that sometimes put us back. So I think that China has that going, where they have a very strict CEO and has a 5-year plans, and they keep upgrading those, and obviously it's working for them. I think that the big driver that's just Larry mentioned, I mean, you know, obviously they're driving to have this consumer economy, and that has really not happened. I mean, I had an experience working with a small or mid-sized Midwestern company, which probably you all know about, is Bemis Manufacturing, makes every toilet seat in America. So you really know the product.
Can't see him.
Well, Bemis is a Midwestern privately held company, and you know, they decided that they wanted to be in China, because if China was bringing all this product in, they wanted to be there. So I was managing the opportunity of developing that business opportunity there, and really to penetrate the Chinese market and get the consumption, it's a tremendous challenge. And for a mid-sized company in the U.S. to go to some basic product like that, believe me, there's all sorts of barriers that happen. And so I can understand the side that we want to make it easier for U.S. companies to participate there. I think that the other thing, moving into the service industry, where China is obviously seeing an opportunity, just like India has taken a lead on that. You know, all your accounting today, your taxes are done in India, while, you know, everybody's sleeping in the U.S. Well, I think China's challenge is the English. I mean, India has got English, China doesn't. And for Chinese, it's very difficult to speak English, and it's very difficult to learn, and the opportunities for them to learn is very tough. So I think that's a burden that China has to become a more, I would say, become more important in providing services as an export. I think the other big thing, though, is important is retail sales. I think that, you know, China has finally surpassed the U.S. in retail sales for the first time. I mean, 10 years ago, China was 1/4 of U.S. retail sales. In 10 years, they managed to surpass them. But I think that there's a couple of things that obviously this strong CEO has as an issue with local unrest. And I think that, you know, I read somewhere in the past week that last year they had 1,600 events of unrest in China. We don't hear about those. And obviously they were very appeased and managed. And I think that going forward, even though every Chinese is controlled on how much they know about the rest of the world by having controlled internet and not having access to Facebook. Well, I don't think any of us want to have access to Facebook anymore. But they are just being controlled, so therefore we don't know about this. But there's 1,600, and those are increasing. I mean, the youth in China is rebelling, and they want to have access to the world and be part of that. So that's a challenge that this strong CEO has. And I think that because of that, I mean, we all know that, I mean, Xiaoping powers today control the three powers. It's like the Holy Trinity. I mean, it's like, you know, it's got military, political, and the governmental power. So that's good. And I think that the other biggest strategy, I think that what China has been doing, and we discussed this in a panel earlier today, is that really China has been filling the gap around the world where the U.S. has retracted. And one point of that is Latin America. I mean, I think that China has really become the main economic buyer and seller in our region in Latin America. I mean, Chile, for example, where I'm from, you know, we have zero tax. We have a free trade agreement with China. I think it's one of the few countries around the world that has that. I mean, any Chinese product comes in with zero tax into Chile. So allowing the free flow of products definitely creates a benefit for them. You know, today, before we had all our mining operations had Caterpillar equipment, all our farmers had John Deere equipment. Well, not anymore. So, you know, Chinese companies are providing those capital goods. I think that the other thing is obviously, I just feel that this weakness from the U.S. and just the government's incapacity of really developing this discussion with other countries and developing our business with other countries has made us say, well, you know, I'm going to be mad. If I can't be in those countries and those economies, I'm going to fight against you so that make your life difficult. So I think that's the point that we're standing right now, where it's basically a point of counteracting this widespread and strategic plan that China has with a big word of mouth. So, you know, those are just some of the thoughts I had, and of course, willing to listen to some other discussions and questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be on this stage here and a great opportunity for me as a member of the faculty here at the university. It's great to have outside experts with this wealth of knowledge and experience that the other panelists bring to show up on campus and confer with us. It's also great to have the opportunity to show so many of you who are not our students what goes on sometimes in our classrooms. And so I guess that's going to be part of my role here this afternoon. I want to take a sort of more reflective view of what economic growth and economic success looks like and how China stacks up to those standards. And when we look at sustainably successful economies and compare them to less successful economies, the single thing that stands out most clearly is the quality of the institutions. That is, and what by institutions I mean the way countries organize themselves, the way societies organize themselves. Societies where it's easy to preserve the wealth that you create tend to thrive economically. Societies where any wealth you create is at risk of being taken, stolen, expropriated, those societies don't do very well. And we see that not in the course of a year or two, but in the course of a decade or two or century or two. And I'd like to think about China from that perspective. So, for example, the first element of wealth protection is property rights. And we take them for granted often in the United States, but in many other places, property rights are tenuous. So, looking internationally, we see that in a ranking of 127 countries, China ranks 52nd in its protection of property rights. So, a little better than average, but well behind any of the countries that most of us would think of as developed, rich, places we'd want to live. Even Italy does a better job of protecting property rights than China does. Within property rights, there's the subcategory of corruption. Corruption is a particular threat to property rights, generally speaking, wielded by government authorities. So in corrupt societies, the government authorities can take what they cannot take in less corrupt societies. In a ranking of 180 countries by corruption, China ranks 71st. Again, a little bit above the average. A little bit better than Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia, for example. Not close in terms of corruption to, again, any of the countries we think of as sustainably wealthy, or any of the countries that many of us, I think, would think of as alternative places where we might be willing to live. So, what does that mean for income in China? Well, per capita income in China is, in a ranking of 228 countries, 106th. So, yet again, a little bit above the average, right? We're seeing a regularity here. Per capita income in China is about $17,000 per person, a little less. Well, Russia's at 28,000, Argentina's at 21,000, Brazil's less at about 15.5, Indonesia at 12.4. But basically speaking, the income per capita in China is consistent with the quality of the institutions. The institutions are not as well developed as they need to be to sustain the kind of incomes that all of us have become comfortable with and expect. In the U.S., for example, per capita income is almost $60,000 per person. That's about 3.5 times what it is in China. Well, a casual statistical exercise, when I try to relate corruption, property rights, and parenthetically the ownership of oil to income, a simple statistical exercise suggests that China's per capita income is actually a little low. Considering the quality of their institutions, you might expect them to even have $20,000 per capita, but nothing more. The point is that given their fundamental attitude towards who gets to keep what they create, you can't expect a society like that to reach much more than half of the kind of incomes per capita that we have. Now, you might say, what about how rapidly China has grown? And there is no doubt about it. China has grown in the last 30 years at an extraordinary rate. In fact, this is the 30th anniversary of my first visit to China. And the way of life there has transformed itself many times over. Nonetheless, it's still, at best, a middle-income country. And while it's easy for us to look at China's growth and think of it as a miracle, if we think more deeply, what it really is a correction. If you look at other countries that have a Chinese cultural heritage, and naturally there aren't many, but just the same, Singapore, 7th richest country in the world, $91,000 per capita in income. Hong Kong, 18th richest country in the world, $61,000 per capita. Taiwan, 30th richest area in the world, $50,000 per capita in annual income. Again, China, $16,600 per capita. So has China grown rapidly? Yes, extraordinarily so. Is that because China is special? And the answer is perhaps, but what makes it special, more likely, is how disastrous the economic policies of the Chinese communist regime were prior to the institution of reform in 1979. That is, you can view the first 30 years of the Chinese regime as being so misdirected, so appallingly misdirected, that while other places with Chinese cultural heritage grew at standard rates and grew very well and healthily, China itself was held back so dramatically that the growth we see now is analogous to the experience you would have if you blew up a balloon, held it underwater, and then let go. If you did that, you would say, boy, look how quick the balloon rose to the surface. But of course, what's interesting there is not that it rose quickly to the surface, but that it was ever beneath the surface. So, my views about the prospects of the Chinese economy are somewhat limited in their optimism. As long as China retains the quality of institutions, of societal organization that it currently adheres to, it is fated to be, at best, a middle-income country. Now, obviously, that's a conclusion based on a fairly casual analysis of a fairly small number of causative elements, but let's review a couple of others just along the way, one bad and one good. So, on top of everything else, China faces an extraordinarily challenging demographic situation. China, which most of us still think of as a country full of people who are relatively poor and relatively eager to make more money, China is about to become a labor-poor society. The consequence of its one-child policy is that it was so successful at reducing the size of its population in its younger cohorts that it is aging more rapidly than any country other than Japan. So it is soon going to have to grapple with a huge retired population, a retired population whose savings are nothing like what would be necessary to support an adequate standard of living in China of today. And the country's going to have to think of some way to deal with that. On top of that, its workforce is shrinking dramatically. The youngest cohorts entering the labor force right now are the smallest of any of the cohorts in the Chinese population, short of those who are 65 and older. So a country that is used to exploiting cheap labor and pouring lots of low-paid workers into big factories is all of a sudden going to find that its workers are really expensive. There just aren't going to be that many of them. That's going to be a huge challenge for China to grapple with, and I don't see any evidence that it's made any serious attempt to deal with that. On the other hand, there is a very strong positive in China's future, and this one scares me most. So if you want to be afraid of China, all the reasons that you've heard are probably not good ones. Here's the right one. In the United States, it's stigmatizing to be well-educated. And any of you who have ever dumbed yourself down so as to not appear uppity or pressing or anything like that in a conversation, you understand that. And if you don't understand that, just go back to George W. Bush and remind yourself of how aggressively he tried to conceal the fact that he had a bachelor's degree from Yale, and an MBA from Harvard. I'll tell a personal story here, as was revealed somewhat to my discomfort, my undergraduate degree is from Harvard. Anybody who has that experience has also had the experience subsequently of being asked, where did you go to college? And answering, Boston. And because the response is uncomfortable. Well, about 15 years ago, I gave a lecture to 150 undergraduates at a college in China. It had nothing to do with my educational background at all. I was talking about my research. But at the end of it, they had a question and answer period. Some individual student raised her hand and said to me, where did you go to college? And being in a different cultural situation, I just said Harvard University. I got spontaneous applause. Spontaneous applause. That should scare the crap out of us, because we as a society are moving rapidly in the direction of venerating ignorance. Venerating ignorance and disparaging expertise. If anything is going to get us, it's the fact that the Chinese appear to respect intelligence. In the long run, that's a winning game. In the long run, having billions of low-paid workers working in factories makes you a middle-income country at best. But in the long run, respecting intelligence, cultivating it, giving it opportunity, that in the modern world with modern technology, that is the winning game. And that's the game that China is playing in a way that we don't seem to have any interest in. So if you want to be scared of China, that's the reason. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of questions for the I've got a question for the whole panel, and this has to do, it's really more on behalf of students today. And I think it would be useful to let students know what would be useful preparation in order to prepare students for the new global realities. What type of study subjects, what type of languages, work experience, contacts, travel, live, and study. I believe there's somebody, Jeffrey, yes, please.
Take his courses.
So, take my course is a great idea. That's true. Although a couple of my students are actually in the audience, they may have different views about this, and you're welcome to speak to them if you'd like. As the more I teach, the longer I do this, the more I love the liberal arts education. The liberal arts education, thank you. The liberal arts education is weightlifting for the brain, right? When you lift weights, when you do bicep curls, it's not because you think that you're going to find yourself doing something productive that requires you to repetitively do this, right? You weightlift to build a generalized capacity, a generalized physical capacity, right? Well, that's not going to cut it in the new economy, right? Because those jobs are gone. Machines do them, right? But what you need is not a particular course of study or a particular set of current facts, because any of that could be obsolete in 5 years, if not 3. What you need is the intellectual capacity to understand the world around you and to adapt to it. So get a liberal arts education, get as smart as you possibly can, and then be ready to take the world on. And it doesn't matter what you study. I would rather work with an intelligent student of English than a low-grade bachelor's degree in business any day of the week, because an intelligent student of English has thought, has learned to integrate, has learned to synthesize, has learned to express themselves, and those are going to be the valuable skills. So I don't care what you study, except in the following sense. I think you should study something you really like, because you're more likely to be invested in it, you're more likely to be passionate about it, you're more likely to put in the effort necessary to be good. Learning to be good the first time is really hard because you don't know what it feels like to be good. But once you've gotten good at something, if it turns out that something else is commercially more favorable, you already know what it feels like to be good at something. It's much easier to be good at a second thing than it is to be at a first thing. So study what matters most to you, get great at it, and then turn to the world and say, here I am. And when the world says, well, here's an opportunity, you say, I'm ready to grab it.
Well, I think that if you do anything with the passion that Jeffrey has shown, I think you'll be successful. So
That's sweet. Thank you.
I think that really that's the truth. I think my experience really, being educated in Chile, having the opportunity to come study in the U.S., which I feel very proud and very grateful to that. And I think that created a specific, it was like a second degree. I mean, it was just the capability of being in another country. I came here when I was 14 years old through 24. And at that time, it's like, you know, English my father always told me, it's like, you need to be developed in an undeveloped country. So, and basically, English, just like for you guys, would be any other language. I think that's a degree by itself. Having the capabilities of living in a different culture, that's another degree. And then finding something that you really like to do, just like Jeffrey eloquently explained. I think that those are three things that I've lived through and, you know, really have helped me a lot and really helped me develop not only for myself, but for companies and just doing the things that you really like is what carries you through.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, study abroad and language obviously are going to be key, and that was key in my life in terms of in '73 going and studying in Japan. So study abroad and learn a language and immerse yourself into a foreign culture. When you go for your overseas your study overseas, and I understand CU has a very active and robust program in that area. Make sure you're not sticking with the other foreign students, that you're getting out and immersing in the culture. And that's important. And I guess the other thing I would say. And this goes to the ability, a little bit of what Jeff was saying about developing an ability to think critically. And this is obviously not just about career, but about life. I always encourage students to read at least one mainstream paper, even if that mainstream paper may happen to be a little bit to the left or a little to the right. If the only thing you're reading is the New York Times, that's good enough. If it's Wall Street Journal, that's good enough. But you need to read at least one of those. And then you can go back to your Facebook feed and do that stuff if you want. But just read one mainstream paper, please, so you can at least get a grounding.
One thing that I worry about amongst students is their aversion to risk, which really frightens me. I can't understand why students always want to know the punchline and always want to be the richest guys in the cemetery at 20. I find it alarming, and it's really depressing to me when I'm in a room full of students and I have the greatest sense of adventure. There's something wrong with that.
I'm sorry, I have to follow up on that. I think that's an extraordinarily important point. One of the things that shocks me most about the evolution of the students that I've seen over time is exactly that, how risk-averse they are and how risk-averse their parents are. You are endowing them, we are endowing them with some sense that the world is fraught with danger in ways that it hasn't been in decades, and they bring that to the classes. And even as something as simple, I'm dealing with this right now, even as something as simple as the way we grade, you know, most of us are committed to a conventional grading scheme where 91% to 100 is an A. Well, think about what that means. First, how many of you make it through the day doing 95%? Okay, if I hit 60% at this point in my life, it's a good day, and I'm happy to have had it. So when we tell a student, you can't get an A unless you get 91%, they say, that means I can only lose 9%. Well, that makes them risk averse right there. It means I don't want to get a hard question, because if I get a hard question, I might only get 80% of it, and that means my A is gone. So you're right, we have endowed this generation of students with a quality of temerity that is, next to the veneration of ignorance, the most disturbing trend in American society to me.
Not
Thank you
bad
for
for
raising
a Harvard guy. One other thing I'd like to mention. I think the study of Chinese is imperative. And everybody tells me, oh, it's so hard. It says, I can tell you that 1.3 billion Chinese are not all geniuses, and they all can't sing. It's extremely important. And one thing I'd like to comment upon, I think that the caliber of English teaching in China is quite extraordinary now, and it's becoming more and more so over time, which makes it easier and easier for us not to study Chinese. And I tell you, the greatest way to be wiped across the floor is to wander into a negotiation in China not speaking Chinese. And they say, well, it's so easy. And as you were saying, the Chinese are now so well educated, so value education, and they're enjoying education in this country. They're really making the most of it. So please do not take the easy route. And by the way, China has no grammar.
I'd like to take 1 second and go back, just back one moment to any comments that other speakers would be interested in commenting on other speakers' comments. If that's
Just
the way to
one.
put it.
About something Jose said. I had a strong CEO, and that was Jamie Dimon. As great as Jamie, or as charismatic as Jamie Dimon is, he is not to be confused with Xi Jinping, because this is a dangerous situation we're talking about now. Larry heard this before, but a very well-known sinologist once claimed that the Communist Party in China was like an anaconda in a chandelier. You stay away from the snake, which rarely moves, but you don't want to be near it. And I tell you that with the ascension of Xi Jinping, the chandelier has just gotten a lot lower, and even Jamie Dimon couldn't do that.
Well, I mean, I just want to clarify that just by saying that his position is like a CEO is just his position of strength, by no means I think that's a successful way of going around things. I mean, I'm just scared of the process they have, and that the certainty of what their plan is, that they're going to make that plan. So basically, that's my point. It's just, they have a plan. Other countries don't have so much of a clear plan, and I think that's a danger.
And I'd like to respond to an issue that I think a couple of us raised briefly, and of course on everybody's mind, is the tariff war with China. If you remember nothing else from your entire visit here, 5 words: tariffs don't affect trade deficits. Tariffs don't affect trade deficits. That's 2 words too many to put on a bumper sticker. That's why we don't have one, but that's what you need to know, and that's literally Econ 101. I know it's counterintuitive if you haven't studied economics, but we actually teach that in Principles of Macroeconomics. So if tariffs don't have any effect on trade deficits, what then is the point of our tariff war? And the answer is, there isn't one. Exactly. There is no more pointless exercise that one could imagine at the macroeconomic scale than to engage in a tariff war for the purpose of reducing a trade deficit. It simply cannot work.
Great.
I hope we don't need to say anything more about that.
All right, I have a question that came around last time, and it's kind of an audience interactive question. You can bring those up if you like. But this question goes to all the audience, including this panel up here. How many people, okay, raise your hand if you speak another language.
Great.
Great, great. Keep your hand up if you speak Mandarin Chinese. Okay, that's a lot. That's good. Keep your hand up if you speak Japanese. Okay. Raise your hand if you've lived in a foreign country. That's great. That's great.
What is a foreign country?
That's really good. Okay, so I've got a couple of good questions coming in. I've got lots of great questions. A couple of questions, all are speaking to intellectual property rights. And one question is, if the steel tariffs don't help protect intellectual property, what will? Panel?
I guess I can start off. Yeah, sure. As the trade guy here, let me, first of all, just to correct a little bit the presumption of the question. The steel tariffs were put on in order to take care of a excess supply of steel in China that was leaking into the world, and the idea was to try to force the Chinese to move faster in reducing the steel capacity. So that was actually a separate trade action, just to be precise here. It was a separate trade action from the very much larger tariffs that had been threatened, $150 billion versus $3 billion of tariffs that were put on because of the intellectual property. And so, but to answer the question, the question is how would tariffs result in improving the IPR?
Yeah, how do we fight IP?
Okay, well, just real quickly, this is not a new issue for the U.S. government. The U.S. government's been talking to the Chinese government for more than 20 years about intellectual property rights. And it's been more recently handled in a series of high-level dialogues that was started actually in the Bush administration and then continued in the Obama administration, where we sat down, tried to identify common ground, find the allies within the Chinese government who actually support reform. There's plenty of people in China that actually see strong intellectual property protection as important for Chinese interests, because China is developing content and it is developing technology that it wants to protect itself. And then try to push that way. But they were moving very slowly, and in fact, the problem is with this new industrial policy that they put in to promote the tech industry, they've moved backwards, because what they're doing now is actually forcing American investors and foreign investors to actually give up technology. They're trying to force financial institutions that invest there, like Peter's old bank and my old insurance company at MetLife, to give up technologies that they use for the IT technologies for financial services in order to be able to do business in China. So they're moving backwards. And so the problem is that they've been stubborn, frankly, in those negotiations. The Obama administration made very little progress on this issue. By the way, we have a whole other series of issues involving the tech companies where I come from in San Francisco, where they're not even allowed to do business. Facebook, Google can't do business in China. And so the question is, how do you get their attention? So I think the administrations, I can't speak for the administration, I'm not a member, and they don't do a good job of kind of telling the public what they're doing. But I think the idea is that they're trying to get China's attention. So it's like smacking a mule with a 2x4 on the forehead to get their attention, and maybe they can start talking. As a tactic, I think it's mistaken, because for one thing, the major problem with the tactic is that all of us in this room pay the price for it. So tariffs, in addition to not reducing trade deficits, as Jeff said, they also take your own consumers hostage. So when we put a tariff on steel, for example, just to go back to the steel example, you all are going to be paying more money for your steel products. I mean, it's a tax. That's exactly what it is. And so the same thing for $150 billion of sanctions on Chinese exports to the United States. Obviously, we all pay the price. And we'll keep paying the price and bearing the pain until China gives in. Okay, maybe that might work, but it's an awful painful way to do it. And also, I don't think it's going to be particularly effective. So but the question still stands, and I think the administration has a real problem to wrestle with, is how do you get China's attention on this? How do you change their minds that this is not in their long-term interest, and we're not going to stand by while they conduct this industrial policy, which is hurting our commercial interests.
Okay, great. I've got a question about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and would the passage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, have made it easier for mid-size USA companies to break into the Chinese market?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, most of the Latin American countries have signed into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, you have Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. And China is making definitely their ways into these economies, as well as co-participating with agricultural products going the other way. So I think that it definitely opens a door. I think the other thing is that we're also not aware or some people are not aware that how Chinese companies are every day in your homes. I mean, today, Haier being the largest appliance company is GE in appliances, or Lenovo used to be IBM, now it's a Chinese company. So, I mean, today, China is in your everyday life little by little. So they might not be stealing, the big issues and the very, very high tech, but in the low tech and in the everyday of our lives, they are there. So obviously, just skipping and letting this Trans-Pacific Partnership, you're definitely closing a lot of doors, not only just with China, but with the whole Asia-Pacific territory.
Why wouldn't we want a seat at the table?
Just to be clear, though, China is not a member of TPP. But I think what Jose and Peter are saying is that by withdrawing from TPP, we've actually taken ourselves off the table to write the trade rules that eventually we hope China would be kind of forced to comply with.
All right, great. Another question. How should we react to China's massive investments in Africa and South America and even Iran? I'm thinking Africa.
Well, I think in Latin America, I think that, the capacity that they're having is, they have a lot of way of funding it. So today is not just selling the products, but they're financing with long-term financing, with very cheap financing for all these countries. So it's a big challenge. Today, the large operations the U.S. used to have to finance through the Inter-American Development Bank and all those facilities have sort of faded away. The old Import-Export Bank.
Is it still operating?
Nobody hears about it anymore. When I used to work with the Central Bank of Chile, there was a key facility there to import capital goods. So all those facilities are disappearing and gradually have been dismembered, while China is taking advantage of similar strategies to place the products in and secure the access to that. So I think, and I can speak for Latin America, I think this is definitely building the bridges very quick and in a very fast train.
I think what's really important is the word strategy. The Chinese are slavish to strategy now. They have a world view, and we do not.
Right.
Yeah, and on Africa, there is this question about, so what does China get out of it? So there is maybe a false sense that you can buy friends by investing a lot of money and putting a lot of assistance into foreign countries. The U.S. did that for many, many years, and we found that you cannot buy friends. It takes much more than just investing in countries. And actually, China has learned some of these lessons the hard way in Africa. They've had problems with some of their investments in Africa. They've caused local unrest. There's been demonstrations against Chinese investments. They've had conflicts with the government. They also have caused problems because they've lent too much, and frankly, the countries haven't been able to repay. So this is not a easy thing to do, and in some ways, so they went in with a mistaken approach that you can buy friends, but they're learning lessons, and Chinese learned lessons. The Chinese government, despite, I think Jeff's right, the institutions are weak, but the people are really strong, and so you have some really smart and people there who learn lessons very fast, and they're learning those lessons.
Okay, next question. This is a student question. This is a great one. Do you believe that China's economic success will influence other nations to embrace similar forms of political institutions? And what does that say about democracy? How should the U.S. react to these potential changes?
I think it's already had that effect. That is what again is mistakenly understood as China's economic success is taken by autocrats and dictators all across the world as an indication that somehow that's a better way to go. I think that's hugely dangerous. And the best way to combat that would be to, unfortunately, provide a better example. We're not doing such a good job of that right now.
I think if greed is lionized and continues to ascend in terms of import to us, we can mistake greed and economic success with countries that we don't want to live in. And I think I'd like to get back to this comment about passports. America is an aspirational country. It's an idea, and it's a fragile idea. And I wasn't kidding when I said, I don't know anybody who wants a Chinese passport. Trust me. You can't get them anyway, but that's another, never mind. But when you get a feeling that China is becoming aspirationally attractive, we're in big trouble. And that's by conflating greed with aspiration.
Okay, great. Here's a quick one. How is China dealing with climate change as compared to the USA?
Bingo. Go
I'll just take a quick cut at that. And well, China has the problem more immediately at hand. So the pollution in China is horrendous. I think by show of hands, how many people have visited China here? Yeah, so you all know. And it's a huge political problem for China. So you know, it's a little easier for them in that way to take on, even though pollution and climate change are slightly different topics. It's easier for them to make the climate change arguments because it's related. They can close coal-powered plants down, and they both help pollution and they help on the greenhouse gas. So it is remarkable. I think that the Obama administration, after many years of negotiation, actually got them on board to join the Paris Climate Agreement. That agreement between U.S. and China was the key to that agreement. It would not have happened if China hadn't joined forces with the United States and essentially coaxed India into it. And so it's, you know, I give China a lot of credit on this. And I give our current administration a little less credit. It's not. I don't think this is forever. I think we'll be back, but obviously, right now, the comparison doesn't put us in a good light.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I have two questions, and we have a choice of a question about President Trump or a choice about old white guys making policy. Which one would you rather take on?
Guilty on the latter, that's for sure.
Well, one of the questions that did come in, and I'm guessing that it's a student, although it didn't say, is are old white guys appropriate for this topic?
I'm not old.
I don't know who you're talking about here. I don't know what you're saying. The only reason why I know it's a student is it didn't say student, but it has a bunch of little funny emojis right next to it, so I can tell it's definitely a student. So, according to The Economist, President Trump does not understand what constitutes a trade deficit, more does he understand how American personal debt factors into a trade deficit.
That's exactly the point I made earlier. And it's not personal debt, it's the federal debt, really. What drives the trade deficit is the federal government's deficit. And while President Trump is claiming that he wants to reduce the trade deficit through tariffs, he, of course, is making it much, much larger by being fiscally irresponsible. So the details of the economics of how this works are more extensive than I can convey to you right now, but just trust me. What's making the trade deficit is the federal deficit. When the federal deficit goes up, the trade deficit goes up. Doesn't matter what you charge for Chinese steel, the trade deficit is going up. It's possible that you might reduce the part of the trade deficit that goes to China. It just means we're going to owe it to somebody else, right? It's not going to change. Again, the class, Economics 2020, you can write that down. That's where we teach it. And it's required of most undergraduate, most freshmen who are going to the business school, for example. So. Everybody should know this, and it's really unfortunate that no one in the administration does.
That's unfair. Only two people, the president and Peter Navarro, believe that.
I was in graduate school with Peter Navarro.
So you know that he's one of them.
No, he doesn't know it.
He doesn't know.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Is the American middle class growth threatened in the wake of globalization and expansion of China's foreign economy? China's economy. Yeah, it's a student question. Okay. Is the American middle class growth threatened in the wake of globalization and expansion of China's foreign economy?
What threatens the status of the so-called middle class in the United States is not globalization, it's our reluctance to respond to it. The rest of the world is trying to do just what we would try to do. They're trying to make life better for themselves, and it's hard to feel bad about that. Now, if what that means is that gosh, I used to be the only one in the world who did what I do, and so I could charge whatever I wanted. And now, oh my goodness, there's someone in Bulgaria doing the same thing, and someone in Vietnam doing the same thing, and all of a sudden I have to compete. Gee, that sucks. Well, if that's your response, then yes, you're threatened, right? If you don't want to be threatened, your response has got to be, well, someone else is doing it as well as I do. I probably ought to figure out a way to do it even better. If you think that way about it, then you're not threatened.
I'd just like to comment on the use of the term the Chinese, because I think there's a real subtext here in terms of the old yellow peril routine. I really mean this. We cannot demonize people. I don't like their government, but when I hear this, the Chinese, Are they supposed to roll over and play dead because we're mismanaging our lives?
Thank you. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks very much. It was an excellent topic.
That was great. You guys did just such a good job. I tell you, so fun.
I said it was stigmatizing because we had a well-educated. Is that the phrase you were thinking of? No. Yeah, to go to a higher well-educated. No, I think, no, I can't remember.